Tonight we're going to talk about the idea of consciousness being independent of the brain versus the materialist view of consciousness only residing within the brain. What do out-of-body and near-death experiences tell us about consciousness, and how does other anomalous activity like UFOs, aliens, and the paranormal relate to the subject of consciousness? Distinguished Princeton University graduate and author of An End to Upside-Down Thinking and An End to Upside-Down Contact, Mark Gober joins me on this episode of Passion for the Paranormal.
Okay, so joining me tonight is Mark Gober. And Mark is the author of An End to Upside-Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness, which was awarded the IPPY Award for the Best Science Book of 2019. He is also author of An End to Upside-Down Living, which came out in 2020. And his latest book, An End to Upside-Down Contact, UFOs, Aliens, and Spirits, and Why Their Ongoing Interaction with Human Civilization Matters. Mark is also the host of the podcast, Where Is My Mind?, which he started in 2019. Additionally, he serves on the board of Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell's Institute of Noetic Sciences and the School of Wholeness and Enlightenment. Previously, Mark was a partner at Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley and worked as an investment banking analyst with UBS in New York. He graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University, where he wrote an award-winning thesis on Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning prospect theory and was selected as captain of Princeton's Division I tennis team. So, impressive resume there, Mark. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. You've obviously got quite a impressive background. The first question I want to get into is, how does a guy with your background and your academic credentials get involved in writing about UFOs, aliens, the nature of consciousness, and all this kind of crazy stuff?
Sure. Well, it was very much unexpected. I was on a traditional business track, and in 2016, this is when I had my shift. I was listening to podcasts. That's really how it started. And I heard some things. I wasn't seeking it out, but that led me to then question some basic assumptions I had about life. And then I started to read books and scientific papers and realized that I needed to rethink everything. And at that point, I wasn't considering writing books. That came later. But I decided that the material was so impactful in my own life that I wanted to share it with others. And that's how the book writing and the podcasting started.
Now, there had been something else that spurred this. I mean, did you have other people that talked to you about anomalous type activity they experienced? I mean, was there other stuff that kind of led you down this road?
Well, it was primarily research based, and with the internet and podcasts and YouTube videos, you can hear about accounts from lots of people. So I was getting information that way and reading books, but I did test things out on my own, because initially when I started with the nature of consciousness, I was learning a lot about the scientific evidence for psychic abilities and things like that. So I said, okay, if I would come across a psychic or someone that sounded good on a podcast or something, then I'd say maybe I should talk to this person. So I talked to some people claiming to have abilities, and they weren't 100% accurate, but there were some things they did that validated what I had been researching, and that I couldn't reason they just made it up because it was too incredible. So there were a few cases like that, and that helped push things along because it was validating what I was researching. And I also had a lot of very strange synchronicities where something would come up that was like kind of a random idea, and then it would keep appearing in different places. And this was happening over and over again, to the point where I was writing these down because it was so improbable. I was doing the math in my head, like, this, how could this be happening? So I was having somewhat mystical experiences, but I've never had an encounter with a being, for example, at least none that I'm consciously aware of. So it wasn't like that. It's been much more of an intellectual experience for me.
Now, coming from your background, I'm assuming that you've dealt with some people that have questioned kind of your going in this direction, and maybe some skeptics. What have they said to you about kind of the direction you're now going with consciousness and UFOs, aliens, all that kind of stuff?
Well, it really depends on the person that I'm speaking to. A lot of people in my close circles, friends and family, have been very supportive, which has been nice. And even my colleagues at my firm, I spent 10 years at the firm, became a partner, and ended up leaving. And in that process, I had very supportive colleagues. But there are definitely some people along the way who have been concerned or just wondered, why are you doing this, Mark? You're on a great track. Why would you go in this direction when you've worked so hard for these other things? And the people that generally say that, which I would say is a minority, I don't think they understand the profound shift that I've had in terms of the way I look at life and the priorities that I now have. So I look at life as something that's beyond just this body. I'm sure we can get into it later, but I used to think that life was totally meaningless and random. And now I think that we're part of something much bigger. So to me, it's shifted my compass, so to speak. It's something I talk about in my book, and End Upside Down Living. Like the compass I have for everything that I do in my life has now shifted. So the other things that I used to prioritize don't matter quite as much. But overall, I would say that there has been relatively little negativity, and I would have expected more when I started. So it's been smooth.
Now, let's say this happens 10 years ago. You had this kind of shift in your thinking. Do you think it would have been different 10 years ago versus today, or back in 2016?
Right. Yeah, I wonder if I had learned this material at different parts of my life, would I have shifted? And I think the answer is that I would have shifted, because, like I said, my compass it changed. So then all of a sudden, things that I was spending so much time and energy on that I cared about just wouldn't have mattered as much, because I would have had a greater context for thinking about life. And I would have wanted to start on that path, I think. And I often think back to, let's say, high school or something, or middle school. If I had known about this stuff, I probably wouldn't have gone into investment banking, for example. I just wouldn't have had the same desire to go in that direction.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and so if somebody would have approached you, say 2015, and said, "Hey, Mark, I had this weird encounter with a strange being or a ghost or a UFO," would you automatically, hey, do you think would have been skeptical about that? I guess maybe it depends on the person too.
Yeah, it would
But
have. It's a good question. It would have depended on the person. I would have been more skeptical for sure. I remember you reminded me of this conversation I had. This was maybe in 2015 or maybe 2014, in that era. So this was before, if you want to call it an awakening. And this was someone who's in the space of manifestation, the idea that our thoughts have an impact on physical reality around us. And I remember the conversation I had with this person, because I said, this is bogus, because in order to affect the physical world, you have to physically like touch something or move it. What do you mean that your mindset could shift physical reality? It just didn't make sense to me, because I didn't have a conceptual framework for thinking about consciousness where those sorts of things could have been possible. So I might have been more open to something like UFOs, because UFOs on their own don't require the supernatural in the same way as other things do, even though I think the UFO phenomenon, as I see it now, is related to those things. So I might have been open-minded, but it took a lot of research for the pieces to fit together. That's the way I've looked at it. It's almost like I've come across so many pieces of evidence in different areas that there has to be something to shoot all of that down. Whereas before I didn't have any of that. So it was much easier to just dismiss a one-off anecdote.
Yeah, you still get skeptics or cynics, if you want to call them that, even though we've had these Navy videos come out, of FA-18s tracking UFOs. Neil deGrasse Tyson's still one that to this day is. And some of the thinking is, well, it's virtually impossible for these ETs to if you want to call them that, aliens, to travel such vast distances. It's basically beyond our known laws of physics. What would you say to someone, say like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who has that kind of objection?
Well, the objection he makes is based on a set of assumptions about what other species can do from the lens of what our civilization can do. And making assumptions from that lens to me is dangerous, because we could be dealing with something that is so so far beyond our ability to conceptualize it. Why should we make those judgments? Why should we make those assumptions?
Yeah, and I totally agree. That's been my biggest issue with some of the skeptics or cynics, if you want to call it that, is we're trying to superimpose, if you will, our knowledge of physics onto beings that may be way more advanced than we are. And it's I mean, we don't know everything there is to know about the universe and physics. We only know a small part, and that's been kind of my issue too. Is we can't try and understand something far advanced from where we are by using our own level of rationale and thinking.
Yes.
Just seems like a bridge too far, and that's kind of been one of my issues as well. What was the first? Was it the UFO topic, ghosts, near-death experiences? What was the first one that really kind of spurred your interest?
Well, there was one interview in particular that I always point back to. It's on a show called Extreme Health Radio. So this was not a show about the paranormal, but it's kind of alternative health. And they interviewed a woman who talked about her own psychic abilities and her ability to communicate with other interdimensional beings. She called them angels, spirits, things like that. And she was talking about it like it was very real to her. And she said she had clients that she worked with, and she used to have a pretty mainstream background in politics and so forth. And then she moved into this other space. And I just remember being interested. Wow, this woman doesn't sound like she's lying. She sounds like she's pretty serious about what's happened to her. And her name's Laura Powers. At the end of this interview, she said, well, I have my own podcast called Healing Powers, where I've interviewed other people that have these experiences. So at that time, I was just listening to a lot of stuff. I lived in San Francisco and had long drives to Silicon Valley with lots of traffic. So I said, okay, let me just turn on this podcast. At that point, my worldview hadn't shifted. And it was person after person coming from different backgrounds of saying very similar things. There's one in particular in her series. By the way, I started listening to her episodes in 2016 because that's when the most recent ones were. I ended up listening back to all of them, which went all the way to 2011. So I listened to lots of her interviews, and there was a guy named Paul Davids who also went to Princeton and was a psychology major like me, and was talking about his paranormal experiences with a colleague who was deceased. And he wrote a book with all describing the encounters that he believes he had with his deceased colleague. And there were some very compelling case studies. And I remember when I listened to that, after having listened to many others, I was kind of unable to move. Like, wait a second, is this real? Is there stuff that we can't see with our eyes? And it was sort of incremental events like that where I'd hear someone that would be particularly compelling to me, and then I'd find scientific evidence, and then it was a gradual process.
Yeah, and you mentioned synchronicities. Did some of those occur after you kind of had this paradigm shift about consciousness, about anomalous type activity? Did some of those experiences happen after your mind shift happened?
They picked up in a big way because I was not having those kinds of experiences before. And if I did, they were much more minor, and I would have just brushed them off. But they started to happen in a way that it was undeniable to me. And it's hard to express that to others because you like to have the context for my life and what was going on, and to see when these certain things would appear. It was just, it became clear that something beyond chance was happening, and it was happening over and over again. So that was a personal validation for all these things that I was researching about. And it was incredibly disorienting to go from this place of thinking life was meaningless, and that was my whole life, and I was going in one direction, to, wait a second, I might be missing the biggest things out there. I need to rethink my whole life. And most of the people in my network have no clue about any of this. So I felt very isolated in that period because I didn't really have people to talk to. Although, like I said, I started to engage with some psychics or people that did energy healing, people in that realm. And they were very helpful to me because I learned that a lot of people are into this stuff. And now I know that there's a whole field of it. At the time, I didn't. So it was a weird phase.
Yeah. And do you feel like that there's kind of a shift occurring in consciousness here, present day? What's kind of your sense on that? Do you feel like a lot of people are kind of shifting in this direction, or is it slowly? What's kind of your sense on where we're at present day with this stuff?
In some ways, I feel like there is a big consciousness shift that's happening, and it's, even in the last 6 years since my awakening, that we've seen progress. But in other ways, I feel like there's not a shift because there's so much evidence out there, and the fact that many people won't look at it, or they will just dismiss it without actually investigating, or even some people that I know who I'll talk to about this stuff, and they'll say, Mark, you're probably right, but I don't want to go there because my life's pretty good and this stuff would shake up my world. And I can understand that perspective. So there are these psychological hurdles that are a hindrance to some people, whereas others I have seen awakenings happen. So it's hard to say.
I've seen that happen a lot with, I will get, I've been involved in paranormal investigating for several years now. Perhaps my journey is somewhat similar to yours in that I kind of started as a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. And it was one of those things where I kind of had to experience it myself to really be convinced. And that's the way it is, I think, for a lot of people. It's like, well, when it happens to me or when I experience it, then I'm going to be more of a believer in it. And I think that's kind of the direction I was heading. But I get people who will say, why dabble into that stuff? Why? Why do you need to? And perhaps some of that is just the fear-based stuff that's, kind of associated with the paranormal. And, a lot of people see Hollywood movies and I don't know, but have you had some experience with that, with people saying, why even dabble into that?
Yes, I definitely have. And I think they say that from a place of not understanding the implications of all this. Because when we start trying to understand the nature of reality and our place in the universe, it starts, at least for me, places a new meaning on life. And that can imply that there are certain things that are more optimal to be engaging in life, for example. So to me, that's critical because it governs how I do everything. And if without that understanding of how significant it is, I can understand why people brush it off. Because to them, it's, oh, well, maybe this is real, but it's fringe. It's not going to really affect me. To me, this is central.
Yeah, and when it comes to the UFO phenomena, certainly many people that I've talked to, they may be aware that, there's been these videos out there since 2017, but they just kind of brush it aside. And like, hey, this doesn't affect my life. They're concerned about some of them living paycheck to paycheck, trying to make ends meet. They have a lot going on in their lives. Well, this doesn't directly impact me. So, hey, I don't care sort of view. And yeah, it is surprising sometimes because to me, it's one of the most compelling issues we're faced with is, especially when it comes to UFO phenomena, ETs, are they visiting us? Have they been visiting us for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years and interacting with us? And if true, what we've been taught in history books, isn't the full picture here. And so there's a lot more to, I think it's really expanded my kind of worldview, if you will, or, view on the universe. And, it's encouraging when you do see people that you talk to where you think, well, they're probably not interested in this stuff. And then they will start opening up and saying, yeah, I've really kind of, shifted my view on these things. And even perhaps religious people I've talked to. So it's interesting. I think it is kind of opening up some, maybe slowly. But yeah, there are still a lot of those people there that are just, there's a lot of apathy out there as well, which kind of surprised me. I want to talk about Dr. Edgar Mitchell. He was obviously a guy, Apollo 14 astronaut, walked on the moon. He was very into, learning about consciousness, the UFO phenomena. How did you come about getting involved in the Institute for Noetic Sciences and his work?
So I was first introduced to the Institute in 2017, which is after I had written my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, but it wasn't published yet. And the Institute of Noetic Sciences conducts rigorous science around many of these phenomena. So testing things like energy healing, lucid dreaming, psychic abilities, showing that those things are statistically real. And it's it's such a controversial topic that within academic institutions, many scientists are not allowed to pursue those things, or they're told you can do that, but you're not going to get tenure. So the Institute of Noetic Sciences is a very unique place because it's an independent organization and it's looking to do these things exclusively. And I had just written a book that was all about the scientific evidence for this stuff. And I often quoted Dr. Dean Radin, who's the chief scientist. And so there were many synergies. When I was first introduced to the Institute, Edgar Mitchell had already passed away. So I never met him personally. And at the time, my focus was, I mean, I had heard about extraterrestrials. It was coming up in my research and UFOs and things like that. But I was so focused on psychic abilities, consciousness after the death of the body, trying to show that those sorts of things are real, like near-death experiences, children with past life memories, studied at the University of Virginia, mediumship, stuff like that. So that was the focus of the relationship. And as I've gotten into this more and more, I've realized that Edgar was very interested in extraterrestrials, and I quote him several times in my book. Early in the book, the introduction, he was asked essentially, why is he so interested in this topic? And he said, well, it's important because it's real. He was very clear that this is a real phenomenon and that these intelligences have been interacting with our society for a very long time. And that was compelling to me because, I mean, he took such a big leap after being an astronaut to form an organization focused on studying consciousness, a very controversial thing, because he had an experience in space, he claims, where he felt the oneness. He felt what many people have described, and that shifted his worldview. And there are also reports about ESP studies he conducted secretly. So to me, that's powerful when someone of that stature is so convinced. He also grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, and he came back from school and he talked to people in the town, and they said that, yeah, there was something going on that we're not being told about. I mean, certainly there are many other credible people that helped to influence my views, given that I haven't had a personal experience, but that was definitely an important one for me.
Yeah, so there's also, for when it comes to Dr. Edgar Mitchell, he had insiders that he knew in government that said that, reportedly, he had said that Roswell happened, and, there was debris recovered. And so, that even kind of lends, a guy like that is obviously going to have some inside contacts, a guy that well known, with that kind of credibility. And that kind of even lends even further credence to me on, the fact that something significant happened at Roswell going all the way back to 1947, but that he had insiders inside the government that said, yes, it was a real thing. Now, I don't think anybody knows who those insiders are, but it certainly does kind of lend credibility to, the fact that event did happen and something significant happened there. Mark, what do you think from kind of your viewpoint? What do you think is a major thing that happens with people where they start to shift their viewpoints, similar to what you have done?
Well, I think you nailed it earlier when you said that typically when people have a personal experience, that's what will do it. And what I found is that if it's a dramatic personal experience, it's usually something that people can't return from. And that can be from certain psychedelics. DMT in particular is one that seems to shift people, dimethyltryptamine. Near-death experiences seem to be incredibly powerful, usually in a traumatic fashion because the person almost died. But when they're resuscitated and come back, many of them have experiences or report experiences that completely change the way that they live. They become much less materialistic. They often then believe in God or the supernatural. They believe they're part of something. Sometimes in meditation experiences. So spiritually transformative experiences tend to be a big way to shift people. My path, although I did have some experiences with synchronicities, it was still very much intellectual. And I found that is not as common, which I can understand because I know how much time and effort it takes to get to that point. I really had to go all in, and it's been almost 6 years of this where it's been all in. I ended up leaving my firm to pursue this full time because I just wanted to understand it better. And even when I was working, when I wasn't in the office working on our business deals, I was researching this stuff. And it took that much effort to get me over the hump, because I describe it almost like a stock price chart. If you look at it over many decades, it has a general trajectory upward, but there's lots of ups and downs in the middle of it. And another way you could look at it is, it's like you take steps backward if you're not focused on it as much. And in order to push forward again, you need more reinforcement. And I was getting a lot of that reinforcement, and you have to really want to do that to get to that point.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is life-changing for a lot of people. Talk about how, I mean, I know you've said you've made some career changes. How else has this kind of really influenced, impacted your life?
I'm much less tolerant of things that I don't believe to be worthwhile. And when I say worthwhile, I now have a sense of meaning. I don't want to claim to fully understand it because I don't know if anyone does. But I think there's something, as you were alluding to, this notion of the evolution of consciousness, both as individuals, but also collectively. I think there's something to that we're moving toward a state which many people who reach these transcendent states at a near-death experience or otherwise, they talk about us being all interconnected as part of the same consciousness, and that interconnected consciousness is made out of unconditional love. And they say, look, I can't really explain this to you, but that's what it is. And it's such a consistent message. Also in the near-death experience, which is relevant to your question, people often report a life review where they relive the events in their life, but not only through their own eyes, also through the eyes of people that they impacted. So I interviewed for my podcast, it's called Where Is My Mind, is the podcast series, a man named Dannion Brinkley, who had 4 near-death experiences. And each time he had a life review that he was able to remember. And he remembers his combat days in Vietnam, where he killed people. So he had to relive the deaths of the people that he killed through their eyes. And he also felt the pain of children that would no longer have a father because he had killed the father. So he felt the indirect effects through these people's eyes. And that points to the interconnectedness, but it also points to something about how we're supposed to live. So he came back just like many other near-death experiencers, and he says things like, the little things that we do in life, those are the big things that matter in the life review setting. We need to treat each other well because we're all interconnected. So with those sorts of ideas running in my mind, I'm focused on, number one, trying to treat people well, which I did think I was doing before, but now it has much more meaning because it seems like it's built into the fabric of reality somehow. But also this notion of the evolution of consciousness. I want to be involved in those kinds of activities. And that's why I write books and have these conversations, because you never know who's going to be affected and how. Just like I was affected by one conversation. It was like the first domino. And what it's done in my own life, it's unbelievable where I was then versus where I am today. So that's a major shift.
Now, Mark, have you talked to people, family members, friends that you've had these conversations with where it's impacted them and kind of changed their trajectory?
It's interesting you say that. I think one of the reasons I first decided to write my first book was because I was having those conversations as I became more comfortable with it. At first, I didn't want to talk to anybody because it was too crazy, and I didn't have the language to explain what I was learning. But I was learning so much that I started to be able to verbalize it. And so I'd have casual dinners with just friends in San Francisco, for example, and I would just talk about some of the things I was learning. And people would just sit there with their jaws dropped. Like, I can't believe that. I didn't know there was science that was being done at the Institute of Noetic Sciences founded by an Apollo 14 astronaut, or that there was a lab at Princeton run by the former dean of engineering for nearly 30 years where they studied psychic phenomena, or the University of Virginia, things like that. And people would say, oh, Mark, I've been thinking about the conversation we had a few weeks ago. Like, it was stimulating things for them. And I think it was that feedback I was getting combined with my own personal interest where I said, let me try to have a greater impact here. And that's where it started.
Yeah. And somebody comes along and says, and this will be kind of when it comes to you've been talking about near-death experiences. I've had other people on my show as well who've had near-death experiences, but someone comes along and says, well, there's still brain activity after someone's, the neurons or whatever are still firing, the synapses. Perhaps this is wishful thinking and it's what they want to see. What say you when someone approaches you with that kind of viewpoint.
Yeah, and I get that a lot. Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia does a really good job of going through all the explanations that people try to come up with to explain away a near-death experience as just a hallucination. To me, the strongest one out of many, it's known as the veridical out-of-body experience. So when people have this near-death experience, let's say they're in cardiac arrest, they're in a state where they should not be capable of producing complex cognition of any kind. So even this argument that, well, you could have some small residual brain functioning, well, people are having experiences that are realer than real. That's what they say. So that's very hard to explain with the tiny amount of brain functioning. But what's even harder is people hover over their body, sometimes outside their own room that they're in, like in the hospital. And when they're resuscitated, they explain what they saw from that vantage point outside their body. And sometimes it's accurate. That's the term veridical. Those cases are very difficult to explain by saying, oh, it's just a product of the brain because it's from outside their body. How else could that happen? There's a book called The Self Does Not Die. It came out a few years ago that documents these cases of they're called veridical out-of-body experiences or anything veridical, because then it's not hallucinatory. By definition, it's validated by someone who was not in the near-death state, like the doctor or family members will say, oh, yeah, that did happen. How did you know? Because you were out. Those to me are extremely powerful.
Yeah, I want to ask you, so the scientific viewpoints are more the materialism viewpoints of science. Do you think that's still kind of ruling the day, or do you think science is even starting to move more in the direction of quantum physics and greater understanding of consciousness?
To me, it feels like materialism is still ruling. And materialism means that everything can be reduced to matter, including consciousness. So the reason that we're all conscious right now is because of stuff firing inside our skulls, in our brain, and consciousness pops out. That's the materialist perspective. So that means things like psychic abilities, non-local consciousness, the survival of consciousness after the body dies. Those things are impossible, because everything should just be in your brain and it's there while you're living. When your brain shuts off like a computer, there's no consciousness. That's what materialism says. And that is still the dominant paradigm. But I will say that I'm hearing more and more challenges to this perspective. And I think part of the openness to the challenges is that mainstream science still does not understand consciousness. Even though mainstream science knows that we can find tight correlations between what's happening in the brain and what happens to our conscious experience. Meaning, let's say you stimulate the part of the brain responsible for vision, the person might have a corresponding change in the way that they're seeing the world. We can do that really well based on neuroscience. The problem, however, is scientists still cannot prove that the brain is causing the experience. So to quote a philosopher named Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, he talks about this fallacy: correlation does not imply causation, where he says, imagine you have firefighters showing up at the scene of a fire. And let's say you have a bigger fire, you have more firefighters that show up. There's a very strong relationship between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters that appear. He says, should we assume then that the firefighters caused the fire? It's not necessarily the case that just because two things are related that we know that one thing is causing the other. There are other explanations for it. And because science does not understand how the brain could create consciousness, all they know is the correlations. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. So everyone acknowledges, hey, we don't understand it. What the materialists will say is, well, it's just because we don't understand the brain very well. So at some point in the future, once we understand the brain, we're going to figure out that correlation is actually causation. But we don't know it yet. And I think because of that, because we don't have an answer to the hard problem of consciousness, Science Magazine actually listed its top 25 questions remaining in all of science. Number 2 on the list, to paraphrase it, is how is the brain creating consciousness? The way they say it is, what is the biological basis of consciousness? And it, of course, assumes that consciousness is based in biology, and I would say it's not. But it shows you that this is a big question. And because of that, you're hearing more alternatives. People talk about panpsychism more these days, which is sort of this idea that consciousness is in everything. There are different types of panpsychism, but that's becoming more in the mainstream. Sam Harris, who's famous for being pretty atheistic, his wife wrote a book that was at least asking some of these questions, Annika Harris, her book's about consciousness. So there's more talk like that than there was when I was writing the book. in 2017, let's say, but the mainstream paradigm is still materialism.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned in the book, you actually, I think you have a paragraph devoted to talking about quantum physics. For you, how does that come into play with, consciousness, anomalous activity, sort of thing?
It's really important to keep in mind because most of the way that we perceive the world is in a Newtonian fashion. Like if you drop an apple, it falls to the ground, gravity. These are things that are common sense and they appeal to our sensory organs, the way that we perceive the world, which of course is limited because it's just the way the human body perceives. Like there's all kinds of light that we can't see with our eyes. There are types of sound waves that we're not perceiving. But Newtonian physics, which is well established in its own way, appeals to us like billiard balls. You can calculate the velocity of one hitting the other. It's like mechanistic. The quantum world brings into question a lot of that stuff. So one of the phenomena is known as quantum entanglement. And this is the idea that two particles that are far away from each other in space and time have an instantaneous and simultaneous relationship. So another way of saying it is if you affect one, the other one that's far away is impacted at the exact same instant in a correlated manner, as if they were interconnected, and we can't see that connection with our eyes. So, I mean, Albert Einstein called that spooky action at a distance. He tried to disprove it, and in trying to disprove it, he actually showed that it's a reality. And now in physics, this is established as something real. So that brings into possibility all sorts of paranormal phenomena or even technologies by advanced civilizations. And now we even have things like quantum computing that is we're applying this to our own society. Also, it's known as the observer effect. In my book, In End to Upside Down Thinking, I have a full chapter on this stuff. In the new one, In End to Upside Down Contact, I just mentioned it briefly. But the idea is that the observer seems to impact reality. And there are various interpretations in this. So some scientists will not take a mystical perspective. I tend to think that it points to something mystical. But the classic experiment, it's called the double slit laser experiment. And basically what happens is the way that particles behave changes depending on whether or not there's an observer. So that is a big deal. If consciousness entering the picture is somehow impacting the physical world around us, then that means the mind is more powerful than we are taught to believe it is, and that makes very possible paranormal stuff.
It's mind-blowing to think about this stuff sometimes. Talk about the title of the book, because you've used that in several of your books, and Into Upside Down Thinking. How'd that come about?
Well, I had written the book, and I was very lucky to get a book agent, Bill Gladstone of Waterside Productions, who writes books in this area. And I cold emailed him because at the time I didn't know anything about books, and people said, "Oh, you want to get it published? You should reach out to a book agent." And I said, "What's a book agent?" And book agents are people that work with publishers. So I reached out to him, and I got lucky that he responded. And he was like, "We need to work on the title of this book," because I didn't really have a firm title. So he came up with the title of the book, and then I've used that because everything I learned about seems to be upside down. So I just use a different last word. But An End to Upside Down Thinking, in particular, relates to this idea of materialism. Materialism says that matter is fundamental. And the universe started with the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago or something like that, filled the universe with these pieces of matter. Those pieces of matter were interacting with each other. We call that chemistry, the interactions of pieces of matter. So we started with matter, then we get chemistry. And when you have a lot of chemical reactions in a big universe, chance tells us that we'll end up with a molecule that can replicate itself, like DNA. So that leads to biology. We started with matter, then we got chemistry, then biology. And then with biology, we end up developing organisms like humans that develop brains, and then consciousness comes at the end. So matter creates consciousness through these various processes. And I use a diagram that Dr. Dean Radin has used, and I adapted it slightly. He's from the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It's like a pyramid shape or a triangle where at the bottom is matter, at the top is consciousness. What I show in the book is that consciousness goes at the bottom, not at the top. So consciousness is before matter. And that's the way I look at it. Consciousness is fundamental, and the body and everything material are vehicles through which consciousness has an experience. And that's the upside down thinking.
Yeah, wow, that's an interesting way of looking at it. So you start with consciousness at the baseline, and everything kind of flows from there. Yeah, it's amazing when you start to kind of try and peel back some of this stuff and think about it in that way. It kind of changes your whole perception of things. It's quite fascinating. I'm always interested, Mark, in the connections, the nexus between unexplained activity, whether it's UFO or ETs, consciousness, near death, paranormal type phenomena. You talk about it in your book some. How do you kind of make the connection between consciousness, consciousness outside the brain, and extraterrestrial activity?
I would summarize it in two ways. One is about our relationship to these beings. I'll start with that. And the second is ways in which the beings can be experienced. So in terms of our relationship with these beings, whoever they are, if we all exist as part of an interconnected consciousness, which is what I spent, especially my first book and Upside Down Thinking, showing that there's scientific evidence for. The idea, going back to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, is that we are like whirlpools within a stream of consciousness. That's the analogy he uses. An infinite stream of water, where water represents consciousness by analogy. We're like individual whirlpools, meaning we're part of the stream, but we have the sense of being an individual, and yet we're interconnected with everyone. So the individuality is, in a sense, an illusion. It's just the way the water happens to be configured, but we're all interconnected. And if you apply that to any life in the universe, including extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings, that means that we're interconnected with them. They're just a different type of a whirlpool in the stream, so to speak, if we want to use that analogy. And that's one way in which I've connected my past work with the idea of contact. But then also, even before I was looking deeply into things like UFOs and allegations of alien abduction, having these direct encounters, what's been challenging is, when I research, is to understand what people are talking about when they talk about a type of being. Because one person might say that they encountered an angel, and another person might say, oh, that was a being of light. Another person will say, well, that was an extraterrestrial, that was an alien. People use different terminology to describe or to try to put into words their experience, but maybe in some cases they're talking about the same thing and just use different language. Maybe sometimes it's actually a different species. But there are many encounters that people describe even outside of the UFO phenomenon. So in a near-death experience, which to me is so compelling because of these veridical cases, among other explanations, people often encounter other intelligences. They talk about encountering deceased loved ones or a being of light that comforts them during their life review experience, a being that they felt like they've known throughout time. I mean, pretty wild things that they feel very strongly about, that they encountered a divine intelligence. It's usually very positive in the near-death experience. There's a majority where it is negative or even hellish, but the majority of these near-death experiences are positive, and that these are intelligences that are interacting directly with the consciousness of this person. So we have to, for me, we have to think about consciousness. I mean, near-death experience is just one example. There are many others. Phenomena of consciousness where people are having these direct encounters. That seems relevant. And if we tie it even more directly to like the ET UFO phenomenon, I was really surprised to find this in my research. Studies on DMT, the psychedelic, dimethyltryptamine, which is this powerful psychedelic. It's found in nature. It's found in the human body, but it is essentially absorbed very quickly. So we're not having these psychedelic trips all the time. But if you take something like ayahuasca, which is a plant brew, it's a combination of chemicals that allows the DMT to exist in the body and to be active for a long time. So people have these crazy trips and they encounter other beings. There's a man named Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico who somehow was able to get a study approved, because these are drugs that are not allowed to be studied, the psychedelics typically, but he was able to get it approved for DMT, where he administered it intravenously. So meaning it's really strong, the strong psychedelic that's usually broken down. He was going to directly inject it into people, and people regularly reported experiencing other beings. And he was shocked because that's not what he was looking for. And it caused him a lot of cognitive dissonance. He writes about this in his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. He ended up shutting down the study eventually, but they were encountering beings repeatedly. And in some cases, they were reporting things that are just like what people talk about in the alien abduction phenomenon. Similar types of beings, similar types of procedures, and yet their body wasn't going anywhere. This was happening in their consciousness, apparently in some other dimension. And he said, I didn't know anything about the alien abduction phenomenon. And he ended up having to study that. And he said his volunteers didn't particularly know much about that phenomenon either. So it's interesting to me that John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist, he was former head of psychiatry at Harvard, who studied alien abductions very closely. He endorsed Rick Strassman's book because it's powerful. It suggests that at least part of the phenomenon deals with our consciousness.
Yeah, and very interesting work John Mack did. What was your biggest takeaway? Because I know you actually talk a little bit about John Mack's work in your book as well. But kind of what was your big takeaway from the research he did on alien abductions?
Well, John Mack was one of these powerful pieces of credibility for me. Because when I first started with my book and End Upside Down Thinking, I wouldn't have written it if there weren't, places like Princeton and UVA and the Institute of Noetic Sciences and peer-reviewed papers to back up these ideas that sound totally crazy. Because especially since I was still working at the time. So I had to feel really rock solid that there was credible stuff. And that's probably biased the way that I've approached everything, where I want to find these credible pieces that I can talk to one of my, let's say, college friends from Princeton who's super skeptical and say, so-and-so says this is real and studied it, and this is a really smart person. So when I come across John Mack, the head of psychiatry at Harvard, Pulitzer Prize winner, you can't get any more credible than that. And he was studying people who claimed to have these encounters that sounded completely insane. They were abducted by aliens. They had medical procedures done. And there was a hybridization program where the aliens were creating a species that's part human, part alien. And this guy is saying it with a straight face and writing a book called Abduction, and then a second book, Passport to the Cosmos. That's, to me, super powerful. What I gleaned from reading Mack's work, and he passed away in 2004, so we've learned more since then, but he was perplexed. That's what I gather, and I'm perplexed by it. I mean, I've written a book about it, but I don't feel like I really understand it. I see pieces of data, and I'm trying to put it together. It's a perplexing phenomenon, but what he seemed convinced of is that these people were not hallucinating. They were having a real experience that dramatically affected them. And the implications that if any one case is real, that beings are coming down covertly, taking you on a craft and conducting experiments and doing this, often it's reported since childhood, like it's a repeated thing for many people. How does that change the way we look at the world? And that's the way he was talking in his books of like, we need to rethink our paradigms completely. And he actually used a term that I really like. He calls it the politics of ontology. Ontology is the nature of being. And the politics of ontology means essentially there's a cultural worldview that is imposed upon us. And it's political, the way in which we perceive the world. And he started to challenge those politics and say, look, there's a new way that we should be looking at reality.
Interesting. Now, he took a lot of flack as well at Harvard for his work into this. Is that right?
He did, and his biographer, Ralph Blumenthal, who's a New York Times reporter, covered this extensively. And he said something to the effect of, well, Harvard said it wasn't an inquisition, which immediately tells you that it was an inquisition. But ultimately, they let him pursue the research. They just said, look, you got to be careful with it. But they investigated it. They didn't like it, but they let him continue.
Yeah, getting back to the ETs and the ET visitation, what's your sense? You think they've been visiting us for a very long time, perhaps thousands of years, or just fairly recently?
My sense is that this is ancient, and there appear to be different types of species, assuming that they are all different species and they're not like shape-shifting, but who knows, because these beings appear to be able to do that kind of thing. If you look back even at ancient religious scriptures, like Ezekiel's vision, there was a fiery chariot in the sky and creatures. There are many accounts like this, and Jacques Vallée and Chris Aubeck have a great book where they go back throughout history and show events that appear to be essentially UFO or some kind of paranormal encounter, where they might have used different language at their time, but it's very similar. There does seem to be an increase in the number of reports, which has happened in the last several decades since the World War II era. And some people speculate, like I mentioned, Philip Corso Jr. So Philip Corso claims to have been involved in research and development after Roswell, meaning they picked up technology, they were able to picked up alien technology at Roswell, and the government was using that technology and giving it to industry. So there's lots of debate about whether or not he's telling the truth. Some people say he was, some people say he wasn't. His son is speaking actively. Philip himself passed away, but his son has spoken about this. And in a recent interview, he talked about the nuclear bomb because his father, Philip, knew Edward Teller, who was instrumental in the creation of the nuclear bomb. And what Teller told his father, allegedly, was that nuclear detonations impact other dimensions. And these alien beings were impacted by what happened in World War II. And out of their own interest, they wanted to make sure that we're not going to be harming these other dimensions. And that corresponds with when we've seen an increase in alleged encounters. And it also aligns with the work of Robert Hastings, who's written a book called UFOs and Nukes, where he has tracked many, many cases throughout the decades of people claiming that UFOs have been involved at nuclear facilities, sometimes actually turning the nukes on and off. I mean, really crazy stuff. But to your original question, I think this is an ancient phenomenon, and for whatever reason, it seems to be very prevalent in the modern era.
Yeah, so perhaps, and yeah, I'm familiar with Robert Hastings' work as well. There's also a documentary, I believe it's on Amazon Prime, about UFO and nukes, similar to the book. So basically, the idea here is that once we came into the nuclear age, perhaps they become even that much more interested in us, and perhaps even intervening. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
That's the theory, at least. But there are cases even before nukes. So maybe it's certain species became more interested because of the dimension that they're in. I can only speculate. But even looking back at, their interpretations of the Bible, for example, that I mentioned in the book, the work of Paul Wallace is really interesting. He's an Australian archdeacon. So he has a traditionally Christian perspective, but started to look at the Bible from the view that the God that is talked about in Genesis, one of the words used to denote God is Elohim in Hebrew, which is a plural term. So he says, what if we adopt this perspective, which others have as well? Zachariah Sitchin, who looked at the Sumerian tablets, has a similar perspective. Well, what if we say there were gods or advanced beings, not the unified field of consciousness, but these beings were God-like, and it was a group of them, and they were involved in, actually, he says, and others say, creating human beings through genetic experimentation. So there's many analyses of past accounts, which some would say, oh, well, that's mythology. Others might say, maybe that's history, and these were just advanced species, and we call them different names today. These were just advanced species that were intervening back then.
Yeah, it's intriguing stuff. It really is. I want to talk about getting back to alien abductions. You covered in the book, in the latest book. Also hitting on the fact that there's numerous cases. There's a multitude of cases out there. Are there some that you've looked into that have intrigued you a lot more than others out there?
For me, it's really the accumulation of the evidence and the similarities in the accounts. It's not like there was one case that just totally changed my mind. People talk about the Betty and Barney Hill case from 1961 because that was kind of put abductions on the map. And there's some others out there that people talk about. The Andreessen case, pretty interesting. I really like John Mack's first book, Abduction, because he treats it like a psychiatrist that he was. And it's in the middle of the book. It's chapter by chapter going through the case study of what he learned from the person that he was working with about that person's abduction. And it's when you start reading case after case and then listen to many others that are out there, these are really weird things people are talking about, and they're saying the same thing. That's what's been more powerful to me than any one case.
Yeah, so kind of similar to the NDE accounts, a lot of patterns, a lot of similar accounts about what's happening. What do you make of you do get some people that have negative takeaways from their experiences and other people that have very positive takeaways. What have you kind of taken away from that?
It's a tough one to try to understand the phenomenon itself. Like, is this benevolent or something else? Is it more nefarious? And it seems like different people have very different experiences. So it might be that they're encountering literally different beings, and some of them are really benevolent, and others are out to get us in some way. It's hard, and so other people might just. John Mack said this, that if people were able to absorb the experience, even if it was traumatic, it could be very transformative for that person in a positive way. And Kenneth Ring, a psychologist at the University of Connecticut, wrote a book called about the Omega Project, meaning he was comparing near-death experiences to UFO encounters and the type of transformative experiences people had. And he found many similarities. Even though the experiences were different, people were changed in a spiritual direction in a similar manner compared to control groups. So in that sense, there's positivity. But then, like the work of Dr. David Jacobs from Temple University, who studies other cases of abductions, he finds similar patterns that these are happening. There are genetic experiments happening, but he finds when he talks to people who've come back from this that it's much more nefarious, that these beings are creating hybrids that are essentially indistinguishable from humans, but have greater mental capacities and are trying to take us over. It's a planetary takeover. Ultimately, it's not some evolutionary insurance program, which is what some of the people told John Mack, or that was one of his takeaways. So I don't know. I think maybe it's a little bit of both. That there could be positive and negative intent. And in my book, I do cover some of these darker spirits that do appear a lot, and I'm open to the fact that we have to be wary in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just so much. There's a lot of information out there about alien abductions. A lot of people from all walks of life that would experience it. You also get into a little bit in the book about the actual physical evidence we have for UFO ET visitation. What did you kind of conclude or kind of cover there about physical evidence for this phenomenon?
Well, John Mack commented on the lack of physical evidence, and he said I'm paraphrasing him, basically there's just enough physical evidence to make the believer convinced, but not enough for the skeptic to get the skeptic over the hump. And that's pretty interesting, that it's if the phenomenon is real, which I think it is, like, why would that be the case? Why is it so elusive? Is it because the beings are trying to hide from us in some way? Are they trying to give us little breadcrumbs where we have to figure it out on our own? That's unclear. But there are some examples that I cite that I think are interesting. So there are some studies of UFO ground traces, so actual physical stuff on the ground that allegedly came from the UFOs. That's interesting to the extent it's been studied. There are cases also of implants. So people claim in the abduction that an implant was put in. Dr. Roger Lear conducted surgeries to remove some of these implants. He has a book called The Aliens and the Scalpel that has picture evidence. He describes the surgeries. Some of the implants he extracted were identical across different people. Some very bizarre things. He sent the implants to a pathologist, and the pathologist said there was no inflammatory reaction in the cells, which wouldn't make sense based on his experience of where those implants were. There should have been some kind of inflammatory response, which is suggestive of an advanced technology. So the implants, we don't have many cases, but there are some there. There's the case of Peter Corey, and Bill Chalker wrote a book called Hair of the Alien that documents this one case, but he had an encounter where there was hair left behind from aliens, these alien women that allegedly were on his bed. He doesn't remember much of it. Seems like there was missing time or some kind of a memory gap, which does happen often. But he had the hairs, and Bill Chalker had a team that was willing to do forensic level DNA analysis. And there were some very bizarre things that came about there. So, of course, we'd like to see more and more replications, but seems like they did a rigorous job, and they couldn't understand the combination of DNA, and also the color of the hair was inconsistent with what they would have expected based on the DNA that was analyzed. So there were Anomalies there, very interesting book, Hair of the Alien. And also animal mutilations, something I talk about. Linda Moulton Howe studied this extensively, and she was a reporter at CBS and now is really into UFOs. But there's some weird stuff with the animals that are found mutilated. And for example, there's no blood. Like, it would require such sophistication to get to this level. And interestingly, I mean, Linda Moulton Howe's book was written a while ago. There was a report on Fox News of some farmers who report these animal mutilations, and they think that it's extraterrestrial because of the way that it was conducted. I also talk about phantom pregnancies, and these are super interesting cases where a woman is pregnant but doesn't understand how the pregnancy got there. So doesn't have a sexual encounter that corresponds with it. In some cases, I quote a woman in the book who is a lesbian and didn't have sex with a man and became pregnant. And actually, she said that her girlfriend, even though she believed her, became jealous and sort of thought, well, maybe she had an affair with a man because she had this phantom pregnancy. And then typically the pregnancy just miraculously disappears. It goes away. So the woman has symptoms of being pregnant, then it goes away. And John Mack talked about this, that he hadn't seen, when he was alive, gynecologists who were willing to entertain the possibility that something else was going on. So I think these are all intriguing. For some people, it's not a slam dunk, but for me, I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, it is. There's so many facets to the UFO slash ET phenomena, alien abductions. It can really take you down a rabbit hole, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It can take you really deep into the rabbit hole sometimes. Hey, I really appreciate you talking with me tonight, Mark. Let's talk about where people can find your work, websites, more about your podcast, how they can find out about that, getting your books, all that kind of good stuff.
Sure. Well, first, Curry, thank you for having me on your show, and thanks for asking such great questions. Appreciate it. My website is a good way to find me. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. My podcast is called Where Is My Mind? It's an 8-episode series that we did. I worked with producers who usually do sports shows, by the way, but they decided to do a show with me, so we tried to make it mainstream. And each episode focuses on a topic, and it features clips from my interviews with many different scientists. So there's an episode on telepathy, and you'll hear from multiple scientists. An episode on the life review phenomenon, near-death experience. That's a good starting point, I found. People it's like an entry point for a lot of people. And then I have 4 books, which are all available on Amazon. An End to Upside Down Thinking, which is all about the idea that the brain does not produce consciousness, the evidence for psychic abilities, the evidence for survival of consciousness after bodily death. An End to Upside Down Living, which is applying those ideas to how to think about living life. The question I ask in the book is, what is the overall intention of your life? And I seek to answer that looking at these spiritual ideas. My 3rd book is called An End to Upside Down Liberty, and it's applying spiritual principles to political and economic theory. And the most recent book, An End to Upside Down Contact, is all about UFOs, aliens, and spirits and how they're interacting. So the books are available in hard copies, Kindle, and Audible.
Well, hey, Mark, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. Great discussion. Fascinating work, intriguing work. Consciousness, yeah, I mean, it certainly seems to all kind of start with that. And it's just interesting how all this stuff may be interrelated. And sounds like that's a lot of what you're trying to do here is connect the dots on a lot of this kind of strange and anomalous activity that people experience. So, hey, once again, thank you for spending the time with me, and have a great what's left of the rest of your night. Have a happy 4th of July, and happy trails.
Well, thank you very much, Curry. It was fun.